Namaskaram everybody. My name is Rishi Musti and this is day 5, I believe, of the Simply History Series 1, and this is hosted and led by Bo. Okay. So okay. Okay. So last time we learned about the Western invasions, Alexander the Great, and Greek influences and Persian influences on India. Today we're going to be learning the collapse of the Nanda Empire and the rise of the Mauryan Empire and the Satavahanas. This era would be from 323 BCE to 230 CE. So that would be like a good 500 years. So we're just going to do a recap of the aftermath of Alexander's conquests and what happened to India after that. After Alexander's death, his empire was split by his Greek generals, and the Persian region was led by a general named Seleucus. Seleucus was originally one of Alexander's generals, but now he set up his own kingdom in Persia, and he threatened Indian land. The Nandas under Dhanananda, who is now the king of the Nanda Empire, was in very poor condition, and he became very unpopular because his managing of the empire was very poor. And so this is where Chandragupta Maurya comes in into the picture. So nobody knows what Chandragupta's actual origins are. So nobody knows what his actual origins are. But he was most likely a local Kshatriya prince who had some unresolved ties with Dhanananda, which is why he also wished down to take down Dhanananda and replace it with his own dynasty. So, with the wise counseling of his mentor Chanakya, they launched a campaign from modern-day Rajasthan or Sindh and attacked Dhanananda. So basically, like a coup. So meanwhile, so all this time we've been talking about North India. We've been talking about what's been going on in North India. Everything was just North India. Now we're going to look at South India as well. So in South India, trade was super prosperous. The maritime trade route had become very popular. And I've said this before in in our sessions, but I'm going to say it again. The importance of the maritime trade route cannot be overstated, not just for Indian history, but for world history. So the three crowned kings, or the Tamil nations of Chera, Chola, or Pandya. The three crowned kings are just like a nickname for these three nations, the Chera, Chola, and Pandya. These three Tamil nations were the center of trade, and exotic items as distant as like Rome even would arrive in India via sea. So it was like a hub of the maritime trade route. And the maritime trade route would have trades from all the way from Rome. It would be from like Rome to Mesopotamia to Egypt to India, even all the way to China and Indonesia. The maritime trade route would exist, and it was super important. This is how religions, ideas, cultures, it's how they spread via sea. Then there's also the Silk Road. If you studied in America, then you probably know, there's high chances you know what the Silk Road is. The maritime trade route is similar to the Silk Road, except it's just on water. So it was a very, very important route of trade. So the Chera, Chola, and Pandya nations were again Tamil nations, but these three nations weren't like other Indian kingdoms that would just rise and then just after maybe rule for a century with stability and then just collapse. It wasn't like that. The Chera, Chola, and Pandya were kingdoms that stayed for like over a millennia. So you'll see that the Chera, Chola, and Pandya These nations, although right now maybe like when we're talking about this, the year is like about 300 or 400 BCE. The Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyas would rule all the way to the 1500s, which is only like 500 years ago. So they ruled for a pretty long time. They didn't. There was times in history where at least two of these empires would have expanded. There was later, we'll talk about it, the Pandya Empire and the Chera, the Chola Empire, but they managed to stay stable for at least a millennia. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the Tamil Sangam age. So the Tamil Sangam age was super important in Tamil history. The Tamil Sangam age flourished from 300 BCE to 300 CE, and much of the oldest Tamil literatures and epics were composed during this period, like Tolkappiyam, Silappatikaram. Tolkappiyam was like a grammar rule book. Silappatikaram was a story. All of these literatures and epics were composed during this period. Almost every single Tamil piece of literature would be during this time. It was a golden age for Tamils. I'm also going to talk about the Tamil custom of invading Sri Lanka, at least during this time, because during this time the Tamil, uh, mostly the Chola and Pandya, uh, the Chera Cholas and Pandyas, they were very fond of invading Sri Lanka. Don't ask me why. I don't know why, but they were very fond of invading Sri Lanka. They would almost like constantly keep on launching invasions on Sri Lanka just to occupy the island and get hold of trade. The Sri Lankans would keep on trying to repel them, although uh, the, the the Tamils weren't really treating them bad or anything, but they were still kind of seen as invaders to Sri Lanka by this time. Okay, so if you look over here in the bottom image, this is the Tamil, like this is one of the very old Tamil writings. This was probably written somewhere during this Tamil Sangam era or the Chola era, which we'll talk about in the future. And this is kind of how it looked like. And then there's just an image of Chanakya, and then it's an image of Chandragupta Maurya, which is kind of cut out. So the Tamil Sangam era flourished from 300 BCE to 300 CE. So that's like a good 600 years. And most of the Tamil literature, such as the Tolkappiyam and Silappatikaram, are written during this time. Chanakya was the mentor of Chandragupta Maurya. So now we're shifting our focus back to North India. And if you remember from what I just talked about a few minutes ago, Chandragupta tried to overthrow Dhanananda because of his cruel ways and replace him with himself as a king. So Chanakya was the mentor, the guru of Chandragupta, and he was a great strategist. He was a very, very great strategist. And he would be known as the kingmaker for his training of Chandragupta. Even when Chandragupta became king, he would become an amatya or minister who would train, who would lead Chandragupta to success over the years. So Chanakya was very important in Indian history, and just and of course he can't just make all the other generations forget about it. So he wrote the Arthashastra later, which is a book on how to rule, army training, other political overuse, everything for how to rule, how to stage a revolt, how to lead an army, how to administratively govern, everything related to that sort of thing will be in the Arthashastra, all written by Chanakya. So, hmm, okay. Oh wait, just 1 second. Okay. So one more thing is the Arthashastra would be an example. It would be used by later kings. It'd be used by later kings to not do wrong stuff. It would be used by future kings to kind of lead them to success. That's what the Arthashastra was used for. And now we're going to talk about the rise of the Mauryan Empire. So we talked about Chandragupta and how he was trying to stage a coup against Dhanananda and the Nanda Empire. So Chandragupta Maurya, with the help of Chanakya, staged a coup in 323 BCE against Dhanananda and overthrew the Nanda dynasty completely, establishing the Mauryan Empire. So the coup of the uh, the coup of against the Nanda and the Nanda dynasty wasn't some huge war with some major battles. Not much is really known about it, but it was probably just mostly like a surprise invasion on the capital. So Chandragupta expanded his empire. After he became king, he swiftly expanded his empire to encompass all of northern India. So there were like about maybe like 5 to 6 kingdoms in North India that helped in the coup of Dhanananda, and after that they joined the Mauryan Empire. Then later he also would conquer modern day Rajasthan. This would become an issue. Conquering Rajasthan would become a big issue for the Mauryas and their neighbors, the Seleucids. So I was talking about the Seleucids, how they were a Greek kingdom based in modern day Iran. After the fall of Alexander, led by a Greek king called Seleucus, thus the name the Seleucid Empire. And invading Rajasthan made their borders close, and there was kind of tensions rising between the two countries. So the tensions were rising so high that finally the Seleucids decided to invade India and get some part of Sindh or Punjab. Yeah, so this happened in 305 BCE. So by this time, Chandragupta has been reigning for a good, yeah, almost like a good 20 years. He's been reigning. So in 305 BC, they went to war, and again, there's not much really known about this battle. I mean, this war, but we know that by 305 BCE, the Seleucids have lost, and they had to cede Gandhara, Sindh, and Gedroja to the Mauryas. So Gandhara is modern day Kashmir. I'm pretty sure all of you know where Sindh is, and Gedroja is modern day Balochistan. So they had to cede almost all of modern day Pakistan and Afghanistan to the Mauryas. And in return, the Mauryas gifted 500 elephants to them. And gifting using elephants in in Iran or in Europe was a big deal. It was something that would really help because they didn't use it. They didn't have elephants in Europe or Iran. Using elephants would have a huge military advantage. So Seleucus was like Seleucus would later like use all of these elephants in another battle. It's not related to Indian history, but yeah, but he would take these 500 elephants that Chandragupta Maurya gifted him. It was a huge gesture, giving 500 elephants just away, just as a gift to his enemy. And in return, Chandragupta got married to Seleucus Nicator's daughter. So Chandragupta Maurya, during his reign, mostly he was a patron of the arts, literature, architecture, like a few other kings like Bimbisara and Ajatashatru. He was a warmonger, but at the same time, he was a very pious man, and he was a patron of arts, literature, and architecture as well. During the Mauryan Empire, architecture would really be enhanced. And around this time, the Brahmi script started to be used. So the Brahmi script was one of the oldest scripts that we know of in India, other than the Indus Valley script. So, like the oldest Vedic script that we know of. So as far as we know, we barely have any evidence of any Devanagari scripts until like much later, like like 580. So the Brahmi script is mostly it may have been what Sanskrit was even written in. So Chandragupta Maurya, so the Brahmi script was trying to be used here, and later on this would become a huge part of the golden age of the Mauryan Empire. This is not really the golden age; this is just like a more of a start to it. Okay, so okay, so in the early 200s BC, Chandragupta renounced the throne and he became a Jain monk. So Bindusara, his son, he succeeded him, and he expanded the territories further south into the Deccan Plateau. And he was also a very popular king, a patron of the arts and literature, but also a huge warmonger. So this is a map of the Mauryan Empire by the time of Bindusara's successor Ashoka. We're going to talk about him. So if you can see, take the Indus River. If you can see, there's like small bluish line, like the small bluish line over here. This is the Indus River. So everything beyond the Indus River over here uh, once belonged to the Seleucids. After the war, this is what the Mauryas gained out of it. And by this time, we're going to see that Kalinga, which is modern day Odisha, was over here, was an independent state. Now it's not, because I mean, like in this map, it's not, because this is during the reign of Ashoka when he conquered it. So we're going to talk about Ashoka now, or actually he's known as Ashoka the Great, because that's how great he was. But originally, he was not that great. He was a warmonger and not really a patron of the arts or anything at the beginning. Later on, he would become a huge patron of the arts. So in 268 BCE, Ashoka succeeded his father, Bindusara, and he had fought a very violent civil war, and he killed his brothers for a grip of the throne. So a few years into his reign, he invaded Kalinga. But however, seeing like how much violence and suffering he has caused, he decided to denounce his old ways. Ashoka also converted to Buddhism, and after this moment, most of the northern Indian kings would be either have influences from Buddhism or Jainism until around like 580, when it started to decline from India and move into other areas like Tibet. So Ashoka converted to Buddhism, and a golden age of arts, thought, literature, architecture, and philosophy rose. Fun fact: the first ever Ashoka was also the first ever person in the world to create the concept of a vet, which is like a doctor for a dog. Well, not really a dog, an animal, any animal, a pet. And he also, in many places, he banned the killing of animals. So it's kind of a strange transition when you see it. He was he became king himself from like a warmonger perspective, but then he became a very heartfelt person later. So now I'm going to talk about Indo-Greek architecture. Indo-Greek architecture. So I told you about how uh, the Indian and Greek cultures kind of mixed in modern day Afghanistan to create this new Indo-Greek culture. And new architecture was also created out of that. So Ashoka is best remembered for his stone edicts, teaching the empire about like good morals and what Ashoka was going to do administratively to help the empire. And there are like many of these throughout the whole Mauryan Empire. And it was written in the Brahmi script, but he also commissioned Greek edicts in the actual like Greek as well to the Indo-Greeks. In these edicts, he mentions himself as Priyadasi or Priyadasi. In the Pali language, Priyadasi means the favorite of the gods. Okay, so after Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire just like went into chaos. Everything just got like completely destroyed. So after Ashoka's death around in like 232 BCE, the rulers of the Mauryas fought for power. First there's Dasharatha, then Shalishuka, Devavarman, a bunch of other kings that only reigned for like very few years. So the Mauryan Empire kind of lost ability under Emperor Shalishuka, who was one of like the worst emperors ever. And they also lost land to the Satavahanas in the south, the Indo-Greeks to the west. So by 185 BCE, the last Mauryan emperor was assassinated by General Pushyamitra Shunga beginning the very weak Shunga dynasty in modern day Bengal. So, based on how things have been going so far in Indian history, or at least like how I've talked so far, you might think that the Shunga dynasty succeeding the Maurya dynasty was probably a great, strong dynasty, but no. It was a very weak dynasty. The Shungas would later be conquered by the Kanvas, who were also a super weak dynasty, and they would be conquered by the and they would be conquered by the Satavahanas. The Satavahanas were so I'm going to talk about the Satavahanas. So they were the great power of the Deccan. So the Satavahanas conquered the very prestigious city of Pratishtana and became a prominent power in South India. The Satavahanas were of Telugu Kannada origin, but they incorporated other cultures into their empire as well. And they also created a new architecture under King Kanha and Satakarni. The first temples and stupas were built by the Satavahanas. Well, the first stone temples and stupas were built by the Satavahanas instead of wooden temples. Although they were Hindu again, they were highly influenced by Jainism and Buddhism, and they were huge patrons of it. Another golden age flourished under the Satavahanas. So this is kind of a map of the Satavahana Empire. And they had conquered most of the Deccan, and they had a rivalry with the Western Kshatrapas in modern day Rajasthan. So that would be like just about here. It would be the empire was much larger, but there's no space in this map. And Dravidian architecture also flourished in this era. It got more enhanced and it would later evolve into the Dravidian architecture we know today. They also traded with the Indo-Greeks, and I'm going to talk about this, but I'm just going to talk about the greatest king was Gautamiputra Satakarni. So he ruled around 100 AD, and he expanded the empire and flourished under a golden age. This map you see right here is the extent of the Satavahana Empire. And this is the work of Gautamiputra Satakarni. Not this is not like not I mean like not the actual like who draw the map. I mean like literally who conquered the part of India. So he expanded the empire, and again there's another golden age. However, the Satavahanas like rapidly started to decline after the death of Gautamiputra Satakarni, and by 250 BC they were done. They didn't exist anymore by 250 BCE. The Indo-Greek kingdom we're going to talk about. This is like the last part. So I'm not going to talk too much about the Indo-Greek kingdom. I'm just going to say that it was formed out of the people from the Mauryan Empire, and based off the name, you can probably you can quite obviously it was one of the crossovers from the Indo-Maghdi style to the Greek style, and that mixed to become the Indo-Greek kingdom. This was prominent in sculpture too. Sculpture is probably the best example to compare to it. The Greeks brought their marble sculpture architecture. The Indians brought their stone architecture, and they combined it to make realistic statues, mostly of Buddha or other Hindu gods. So architecture, this was known as kind of like the Gandharan architecture style, and it would later evolve into a new culture known as the Greco-Buddhist culture, flourishing for years. Politically, they also expanded into Rajasthan and western and central India. They also traded with the Satavahanas and enhancing the maritime trade route more. I talked about the maritime trade route earlier and it was super important. Okay, okay. So we're just on time. Right before we end it, we're going to do a recap. Instead of me talking, instead of me actually talking about anything, or instead of me talking live, I'm going to share a video with you that I made a few months ago on my channel, Simply History. You can subscribe to it if you want, which is also what this series is named after. So I'm going to show a video from there. I'm going to show a video from there.
Hello, Rishi.
Yeah. So
That was
yeah,
good. Yeah, that was
I'm
good.
just yeah, we're not done. Yeah, we're not done yet. I'm just going to
Okay.
share my screen. Okay. So we're not supposed to be in the PowerPoint right now. Hello, everybody. Okay, so again, this is a video from what I made a few months ago on my channel, Simply History. So this is just a recap. It's mostly stuff that I talked about in this session, maybe a little more, a little less. It's going to just be like a recap. In this video, I will talk about the Mauryas, Satavahanas, and the Indo-Greek trade. So let's get started. After Alexander the Great's invasions on the Indian subcontinent, the Nanda Empire was ruled by a very cruel king called Dhanananda. Dhanananda was very unpopular and he was very corrupt. A man by the name of Chandragupta Maurya did not like how Dhanananda was very corrupt. He had a dream of unifying the entire Indian subcontinent under one rule. A wise scholar by the name of Chanakya decided to help Chandragupta Maurya overthrow the Nandas after Chanakya was previously insulted by Dhanananda at a court. Chandragupta's origins are very unclear. Many Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu sources say different things. Some sources state that Chandragupta Maurya was a shepherd, while others state that he was a distant relative of the king Dhanananda. Chanakya made alliances with smaller kingdoms that were not as big as the Nanda Empire that had very bitter relationships with the Nanda Empire. Chanakya convinced many smaller kingdoms near the Nanda Empire to turn against the Nanda Empire. Chanakya also kept the Nanda Empire's allies distracted so they would not interfere. It also didn't help for the Nanda dynasty that Dhanananda was very unpopular, while Chandragupta and Chanakya were very tolerant and wise men. Dhanananda was finally killed by the Mauryans, and the Mauryans took over the Nanda Empire. They established the new Mauryan Empire. After the Mauryan Empire was established with Chandragupta as its king, many of the Mauryan allies gave him their land. And in this way, most of North India was under the Mauryan Empire. This happened around 322 BCE. After Chandragupta founded the new Mauryan Empire, Chanakya, who by now Chandragupta saw as his teacher and advisor, wrote the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra contained all sorts of things about politics, military strategies, and other things related to the government. By 305 BCE, Chandragupta had conquered most of South India as well as North India. Because of this, King Seleucus of the Seleucid Empire, which was Greek as I mentioned earlier, wanted to destroy the Mauryan Empire and inherit all of that land. And so the Mauryan-Seleucid War had begun. Just a few years after fighting, the Mauryan Empire and the Seleucid Empire signed a peace treaty. The Mauryan Empire gained new lands in the north like modern-day Afghanistan and modern-day Pakistan. In the peace treaty, the Mauryans gave 500 war elephants to the Seleucids, and thus began the friendship between the Mauryans and the Seleucid Empire. Unlike the Nandas and Shishunagas, Chandragupta Maurya was very tolerant, and he was very popular also. At the end of his reign, he renounced the throne to join a group of Jain monks. After the renunciation of Chandragupta, Bindusara, who was Chandragupta's son, became the new king. Bindusara led many expeditions into South India.
Not much is known about his reign, but it is known that he had a son called Ashoka. After Bindusara's death, his son Ashoka murdered all his brothers and took over the throne. Ashoka led a conquest into modern day Orissa, then known as the Kingdom of Kalinga. He murdered many civilians and destroyed their capitals, and then he annexed their territory. However, after seeing all the bloodshed he caused, he regretted his decisions. Now, instead of fighting, he listened to Buddhist and Jain scholars. And like his grandfather Chandragupta Maurya, he was also very popular and tolerant. Ashoka carved edicts and instructions into rocks in the Brahmi script. The Brahmi script is one of the earliest known Indian scripts. These edicts were known as the Brahmi inscriptions. There are some evidences stating that early forms of Sanskrit were also written in the Brahmi script. However, after Ashoka finally died around 230 BCE, his successor, Dasharatha, was a very weak king. He even lost most of South India to the newly formed Satavahana Empire, which was a Telugu empire. The Satavahanas excessively traded with the Greeks, and they've expanded north to the Mauryan Empire. Under the Satavahana kings Kanha, Shatakarni I, and Satakarni II, the empire expanded into North India and most of South India. During this time in modern day Tamil Nadu, the Sangam literatures were being composed. The Sangam literatures were full of entertaining stories, hymns, and poems. So while South India was flourishing in a golden age, the Mauryas in the north were declining. Around 180 BCE, the last Mauryan king, Brihadratha, was assassinated by a group known as the Shungas, thus ending the great Mauryan Empire. Soon after the Mauryans declined, the Satavahanas also started to go into decline. However, around 100 AD, the Satavahana king called Gautamiputra Satakarni restored its power by conquering other kingdoms. It was during this time that the Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyas were conquered by the Satavahana Empire. The Satavahanas also built the great city of Amaravati, which they established as their capital. However, the kings after Satakarni were very weak, and around 300 AD, the Satavahana Empire came to an end. This would pave the way for the Chalukya, Pallava, Chola, Chera, and Pandya kingdoms to form. The Chola, Chera, and Pandya kingdoms were actually getting reformed after being defeated by the Satavahanas. Anyway, that will end today's video. Thank
Okay, so that was just the end of the video. That was a recap. So if you have any questions, you can ask me.
So the Cholas, after they were conquered and the Vahanas went into decline, did they regain their territory and then become the big Chola Empire that conquered Indonesia and Southeast Asia and all that, or is this a different Chola Empire?
This is it's the same Chola Empire. They would later form, and yeah, they would later conquer Indonesia and Burma, and yeah, the Chola empires were they were very great, very massive. This was a more of an archaic form of them, so not just yet the actual empire yet. So yeah,
Okay, so it's like Rome City versus Rome's Empire. Like
yeah,
one's really small and
yeah,
one's really big.
yeah, exactly. So any other questions?
What are we going to talk tomorrow, Rishi? I think, but this was a good session. Thanks, Rishi.
Okay, thanks for reminding me. So tomorrow we're going to talk about the rise of the divided Indian kingdoms, the mostly the Pallavas, Chalukyas, and the Kalabras. And we're going to talk about mostly South Indian history. There wasn't much in North India happening by this point, but we might get to the Bengali Pala Empire, basically like that. But we're Mostly, I think we're going to focus on the Gupta Empire and their golden age and how they expanded. So that's going to be next session.
Thank you, Rishi.
Okay, so any more questions?
Are you going to cover any of the Vijayanagar Empire, or is that
No,
too
yeah, we
far?
will. We
Okay.
will. Probably in season two. Season one is only 5 sessions, meaning like tomorrow is going to be the last one. We are most likely going to have a season two. Probably not literally the next day, but um, we will have a season two maybe after a week or so, and we might yeah, after that, yeah, we will cover Vijayanagara and those kingdoms as well. So if that answers your question,
Thank you.
you're welcome. So are there any more questions?
No, thank you. This was a really fun session. Bye.
Okay, you can all log off now if you don't have any questions. Bye.
Thank you.